Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Brian. You have inspired us. You have challenged us. You have helped us define our journey forward. And we really are grateful to you for being such a courageous prophet in our midst. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's a joy to be here. It's been a long time coming, but I'm so glad I can make it. It's good to be here. It really is.
Thank you. So now it's time for our Q and A segment.
Mm-hmm.
We will do our best to respond to as many questions or comments you may have. We thank our moderator who is sorting through questions and who will help facilitate this activity. Please submit your questions via the chat box and we'll voice as many as time allows. Remember, if you see a question you like, give it a thumbs up to move it up in the priority list. Technology, I'm telling you.
I know. You can't even do that on Zoom, so this is really good.
Yeah. Brian, while we wait for the questions to come in, I had something just to start. You spoke so much about the threat of white nationalism, and it seems like so much of what is behind white nationalism is really fear, just fear of losing something.
Yes.
And how do we make it clear or communicate, or should we even try to communicate that things like civil rights, equality, and justice are not zero-sum games? That if I get some, it doesn't mean you lose any, that it's infinite. Is that even something worth pursuing?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that all too often what happens is that we're divided from each other because we're fed this myth of scarcity, that there's only so much that goes around. And so if with one group gains, the group that's under, that means that other people are going to lose. And I think that's a real pernicious myth. And it's also, used cynically by politicians when we say, keep more of your money, all that kind of thing. It's all about you. And so the fact that I'm going to lose something. And so I think one way to do is to call out the myth and say, well, no, actually there's a whole lot when we think about the great wealth chasm in this country, and we realize that if we could spend over $2 trillion for a 20-year war that we have precious little to show for, what could that money have done in the meantime? What kind of health infrastructure could we have created? What kind of educational opportunities could we have created? So I think a lot of the fear comes from a failure of imagination. But I think another thing we have to do pastorally is that we have to help people identify what are they afraid of losing. And then to mourn the way they thought life was. Because one of the ways that white nationalism functions is that it functions by people not knowing the truth or being fed a very sanitized vision of what this country was, that we're the land of the free and the home of the brave. Well, not for everyone. and we never have been. But you would never know that by the way we tell our national story. And the thing is, when you challenge that story, people get very nervous because you're challenging their identity. They're losing something they're deeply invested in. And so I think, there's a tendency for those of us who are more progressive to say, oh, just wake up and get over it. But I think there's another thing we have to do, and we have to meet people where they are. We have to help them mourn the loss, even if it's the loss of an illusion. We have to help them mourn that loss.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
So we have a question here.
Sure.
From Delphine Bautista. How do we address white nationalism within LGBTQ space?
Wow. Okay. That's another whole talk. But let me throw some ideas out there. Let's start with something that doesn't seem obvious or may seem obvious, and that is, let's look at, where do we socialize? Where do we gather? For example, there's an LGBTQ ministry here in New York City, which is really fine. You know, they do, I'm not going to call their name because they really do fine work. I mean, I have great respect for them. And they host a number of activities of, you know, like gatherings in some of the bars in New York City. However, the bars that they gather at are precisely the ones that most LGBTQ persons of color would not feel comfortable in. I mean, that's an ugly reality we have to face about our community. And so one of the things we need to look at as Catholic LGBT organizations is, where do we gather? And are these spaces where persons of color would feel welcome and comfortable in going? That's one thing we can do. Another thing is to look at, what's our public branding? When I go, you know, give another example. When I was at my former institution at Marquette University, there was an African-American aunt and her niece who would come to campus, and they were trying to find the admissions office. So I said, I can take you there. And he said, yeah, the reason why we're really interested in coming to Marquette is because I looked on the website and I see all the faces of people of color. And I didn't have the heart to tell her. They basically looked at they took a picture of everyone they could find that would match the description, put it on the website. We know how that works. But again, I think branding is important. So what does our brand look like? What does your website look like? What does it communicate? Who's welcome? Whose faces are present?
Great.
Cultivating, you know, how do we cultivate, you know, a sense of welcome? I think part of it too is, what stories do we celebrate? You know, when I teach a course on homosexuality and Christian ethics, and one of the things I do is I have them, we tell the story with the Stonewall event, which most of my students still have not ever heard of. It's amazing in this day and age. Most students that have never heard of Stonewall, and they don't know the stories of the queer, trans persons of color who were the leaders in that movement and the leaders of that insurrection. How do we tell our story? All of these are ways in which we can make LGBTQ spaces, you know, welcoming, embracing, and not just embracing for people of color for them, but embracing of us. Again, this is our story. This is who we are. I think that's the thing I want to, if we can move away from thinking of this as an us and them issue and saying, this is a matter of who we are and of who's included in the we. That's the biggest attitudinal change that needs to happen.
That's great. That may actually cover some of this next question, which comes from Mary Burns, who asks, and I think this is probably something a lot of us are wrestling with, because we are predominantly white. How can, and we meaning dignity, how can we reach out to those in brown communities who may not know about dignity and who may welcome this connection? Okay, cool. That's a great question. And let me answer it by talking about the distinction between two popular movies, TV series that are related to one another but very different. I think many people in the dignity community might be familiar with the movie Love, Simon. Love, Simon tells the story of a young gay teenager as he's coming to understand his sexuality. He grows up in a white suburban middle-class family, and it's basically telling the story. In the end, he gets this guy, and it's on this Ferris wheel. It's really wonderful, and I've seen it like 5 times because I love rom-coms. I really do. It has a spin-off now. It's on Hulu, but you can find episodes on YouTube. It's called Love, Victor.
And Victor is a brown Hispanic person. And it's all about him coming to an understanding of his sexuality, but his journey is much more tortured. And it's tortured precisely because he's navigating what does it mean to be gay and brown? Because if I come out as a gay brown person, I have to negotiate faith, but faith means something different to, Hispanic Catholics than it does with a lot of white Catholics. For example, in Love, Simon, religion didn't play a role at all. It was never mentioned. In Love, Victor, it does. When I come out as a person of color, I have to come out not only to the wider gay community, I also have to come out to my own ethnic community and to my own family. And while all of us who lose family connections, and we know people tragically who have because of our sexuality, it's a terrible thing. But also it means that I can lose my family. That's my only refuge in living in a predominantly white culture. So all this is a wind up to getting to the question, what do we do? One is to understand that the coming out process is going to look different. And I think we need to even question whether coming out is necessarily the goal in all cases. I think there's an attitude in some places of the gay communities that if you're not out, then there's something wrong with you. We need to kind of get you to the place of getting me more out. That's the badge of being, proud. And I think for the story is much more complicated than that, especially for communities of color. I think one is, what do your liturgies look like? I think there's an attitude in the Catholic community that, we don't sing bilingually in this parish because they have their own church. And I think we have to understand that, no, we sing bilingually because that is who we are. We're Catholic. Catholic means inclusive. Catholic means everybody's welcome. And I think that's one of the things that Dignity needs to look at then in terms of what's the music like in your worship. The other is that communities of color need faith reflections in the worship experiences that reflect their unique struggles. And we want to hear ourselves in the faith reflection. And that when we hear ourselves in that story, it's not just for us, again, it's for all of us. And so I think that when white dignity communities realize that the reason why we're talking about border issues, or the reason why we're talking about Black Lives Matter, or the reason why we're singing in multilingual ways, that the reason why we're doing this is not just for them, it's for us and our Catholic identity. When that happens, then we'll have a more entree into brown and Black and Asian communities. I think another thing we need to, I'm just going to throw this out there. Again, I think the question becomes, like for my students, when I teach the class, I always make them go to the Dignity website, and they are amazed that you guys exist. I mean, seriously, they are amazed. They are like, you mean there are gay and lesbian Catholics who are part of the church? They have this. I mean, where were these people when I was in high school? Okay, so they are amazed. You guys have no idea how important you are. So I'm telling you that right now. But the other thing that they want to say is that the kids I teach, the college students and young men and women I teach, they are deliberately intersectional. Mm-hmm. And so if your website, if your materials don't talk about race and racial justice as part of LGBTQ justice, then even many of the white young gay people are not going to find the community a very attractive place to be.
Brian, you were just talking about liturgies, and here's a question from Mary Nichols. To bring everyone to the table, do we need to rearrange the way the table is set? How do the liturgies that are meant to unite reflect our intersectionality?
Sadly, I think that we are far from really grappling with what it means to be truly intersectional and truly welcoming. What does it look like? I think it begins from, and again, I think every dignity community is going to be different. So I'm just going to throw some general ideas out there and take what works. I think it begins from a sense of, am I greeted at the door? Am I made to feel welcome when I enter? And it sounds simple, but let me give you two examples of one where it doesn't work and one when it does. So before I even get to the table, am I made to feel welcome? There is a wonderful LGBTQ community that meets here in New York, and I visited it, for Mass, and wasn't, wearing my collar, just dressed down. And when I entered, no one greeted me. Everyone gathered in their own group, in their own cliques. They all talked among themselves. They all knew one another, but there was no sense of I'm being welcome. So not only am I a stranger, I'm also the only person of color in a group. Why am I even how can I be? We don't even need to talk about music. From the beginning, I'm not feeling welcome. Now, on the other side, years ago, I had the privilege of worshiping with the Dignity community in Honolulu. This was years ago. And they had the custom then, I don't know if they still do it now, but visitors who were there, who were new, they gave us a lei over, to wear around our necks. And it was like, and they, it was like, obviously, welcome, what can we do? This is how we do things here. But it was like, from the beginning, even before we got to the table, I was already welcomed. So I think, so we can get to liturgy, and then we can talk about how the table is set. It goes in terms of whether we offer, options for those who struggle with alcohol addiction, gluten-free hosts, things like that, but also in terms of a sensitivity to language too. That when I hear someone proclaim a scripture translation that uses the word slave, I tense inside. I really do.
Yeah.
Because there's only one group in the United States that's ever had that experience. So I think it's a sensitivity to language. I mean, we try to be sensitive in terms of gender, and that's really wonderful. But I think we also have to be sensitive that there's certain words that resonate in communities of color that really are off-putting. So those are two ideas I throw out there. One is just simply welcome. We're glad you're here.
That's great.
Yeah,
I've had that same experience in Honolulu with that community.
Yeah, isn't it amazing?
And I know I saw Jean Corpus on the list of people here today. I'm not sure if anyone else from Honolulu is here, but
I'll give them a shout out.
Very warm welcome.
And another thing about welcome, and it sounds so simple, but it's so powerful. I remember attending Dignity Masses when I was a student at Catholic University in mid-1980s. And this was after the Halloween letter and Dignity groups were kicked out of Catholic parishes. And so we were meeting at an Episcopal church. And I remember walking into the church and feeling angry that here there was this church full of Catholics, and we had to meet in an Episcopal church. And what struck me was that the rector of the church, who was a woman priest, before the mass began, she got up and she thanked us for worshiping in her church. Because, and I'll repeat because I'll never forget that she said, "You make us inclusive in deed as well as in word. So thank you for being here." And afterwards, I went up to her and thanked her. I shared with her that I was a Catholic priest and that I longed to hear my church thanking gay people for worshiping in the church. And she just looked at me, she gave me this warm embrace and said, "I know you think that we've got it all together, but if you can, stay in your church because we need people like you to move the Jesus movement forward in all of its branches." But just that the idea of thanking people for worshiping and, welcoming people, that goes a long, long, long way.
Great, thank you. Well, we have one more question here, which might be our last one. This is from Sarah Brosnan. And Sarah asks, given the overlap between the opponents of sexual inclusion and racial justice, why do you think there are so many white LGBTQ plus Catholics who are silent in the face of racial oppression?
That is a great question, and it's one that really troubles me immensely. It troubles me because, according to the statistics, Donald Trump doubled his support among LGBTQ communities, that it went from like 7 to 14%. And also that the majority of white Catholics voted for President Trump, despite everything that we know about his policies. I think part of it is that we just don't, it goes back to something I was talking about, to this tension between that part of our community that wants to be mainstreamed and accepted by the mainstream, and that part of the community that says, no, we really need to work for deeper social transformation. And I think it's a sad reality that among many oppressed peoples is that when you're oppressed and excluded and stigmatized, you want to hold on to whatever scrap of privilege that you think you have. And so if I am a white gay or a white lesbian Catholic, okay, I may be oppressed and stigmatized because of my sexuality, but I'm going to ride that white train as far as I can take it. Not realizing that, these people, white nationalists, are not friends. They are not your friends. They are not your friends. I mean, Donald Trump was not a friend of white trans people. Donald Trump was not a friend of white gay people. He was not a friend of white lesbians. And I think one of the problems in our country is that we have used race as the dividing line, keeping the black and brown poor from the white poor from ever joining forces and working together against a common enemy. We also use the same thing, keeping gay persons of color, LGBTQ persons of color, and white LGBTQ persons from working together. And that's because, there are people who, I'm going to be blunt here. The tendency, this is what white privilege really means. It means I'm going to ride the white train as far as I can. That if this is my entree into privilege, I'm going to take it. And not seeing the illusion for what it is. And not seeing that, these nationalists, that's the reason why I want to belabor the point. White nationalism is not just against black and brown people. It's against women. And they don't care what your political ideology. They treat Nancy Pelosi and Liz Cheney the same way. They are against LGBTQ people. And it doesn't matter whether your skin is as pale as Pete Buttigieg or as black as mine. They are, I just think we need to become far more savvy and to understand that white privilege is a dangerous illusion. It's a trap. And it's a comforting one because, like I said, I ain't got nothing else going for me, but I'm going to ride this. This is what I've got. But in the end, they're not your friends. They're not your friends. And sometimes we just have, that's why I want to use the pictures on PowerPoint to make the point plain.
Yeah. That was great. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Brian. Thank you for your inspiring words and your willingness to engage in this small bit of conversation with our community. We do need to wrap up this segment, but we are capturing all the questions from the Q&A and the comments. And to the best of our tech team's ability, we will try to get some answers out to people in the coming days. And remember, the chat box is available throughout the 2-day session, so you're welcome to continue to share comments there.